Hello, this is Cuckoo Town, and I'm your host, Mark Anthony Wyatt. Our intention here is twofold: to broaden the paranormal discussion and to serve you up a delicious smorgasbord of strange by covering all the weird stuff that we know you love too, such as ghosts, UFOs, Bigfoot and the Fae. With the assistance of my knowledgeable co-host, Janice, and occasional guests, we'll also be delving deeply into many associated topics, as we believe there's an indefinable place, a liminal space, where high strangeness meets high creativity, the place where the magic happens, where the spark that gives us inspiration abides and the muse resides. And therefore, art, music, literature, especially weird fiction, film, history and folklore are on our menu too. Welcome to Cuckoo Town.
This is what I played for him.
Oh, the cuckoo, she's a pretty bird. She warbles as she flies, but she never hollers cuckoo until the 4th day of July. Jack of diamonds, Jack of diamonds, you're the meanest heart I know. Well, you up my poor pockets, my silver and gold. I'm going up on a mountain, gonna build me a whiskey still, and I'll sell you one bottle for a $20 bill. Going up on a mountain.
Hello, and welcome to the very first episode of Cuckoo Town, Aleister Crowley and the Tregerthen Horror. We have some fascinating guests and many diverse topics lined up for future shows, but today's episode will just be Mark and me, Janice. Mark has been researching the Tregerthen Horror for several years now, and he feels it might be of interest to other people, especially those with an interest in the paranormal, black magic, espionage, history, and of course, the self-styled beast himself, Aleister Crowley.
The Tregerthen Horror is centred around a mysterious, suspicious death in the far west of Cornwall way back in 1938. It was an untimely death of an upper-class English lady at the age of only 51, which allegedly involved Crowley summoning up dark entities and somehow being responsible for her death. He was never charged with her murder, and many people, including respected writers, don't even believe he was present at the death scene. But those of us who've researched for Tregerthen Horror at a deeper level know that there's more to the story, that there was no smoke without fire. On this episode, we will also briefly be discussing some intriguing links that go back to the First World War era, with creative people like D.H. Lawrence, Philip Heseltine, also known as Peter Warlock, and other famous creatives of the day. The Tregerthen Horror is a fascinating tale that is slowly becoming a part of Cornish folklore. In years to come, it will, I believe, sit comfortably alongside the more traditional Cornish lore, the merry maids, the knockers, the piskies, the Spriggans, Morgawa, the owlmen, and the giants too. Cornish folklore is a diverse, living, constantly evolving thing.
So what exactly is the Tregerthen Horror?
Well, there are a few different versions that I've heard or read about, and they all vary to some degree. I know a lot more detail about the characters and events now than I did when I first heard the story, and I'm going to hold back some deeper information for later, as I don't want to get too far ahead of myself or confuse any listeners. The first version of the story I heard says that Crowley was staying with a couple called the Vaughans, Gerald and Ella, at Carn Cottage near Zena, in the far west of Cornwall, which is in the extreme west of England, on the night of the 22nd of May 1938 and into the very early hours of the next day, the 23rd. The cottage was situated just under the top of Zena Carn, a 300-foot plus hill, in the tiny hamlet of Upper Tregerthen on the outskirts of Zena, on the north coast of Cornwall. They were said to have been performing magic rituals, so-called black masses, to summon up dark entities when events had got out of hand. There was a lot of paranormal activity going on. Doors were slamming. Dark shadows were moving menacingly around the walls. There were strange noises. Furniture was moving of its own accord, and, apparently, the devil made an appearance too. Ella, much younger than her partner Gerald, was, naturally, given the circumstances, terrified, so the story went, she left the cottage in a hurry, screaming, then ran down the hill, which wouldn't have been easy in daylight, let alone in the dark, as the tough moorland undergrowth there would have been about 2 to 3 foot high, and she would have had to have dodged and leaped over large granite rocks and animal nightlife as she did so. I know, I've been there a few times. It might help to paint a picture of the scene for those not familiar with that part of West Cornwall if I quote D.H. Lawrence here. He lived within minutes of Carn Cottage 20 plus years earlier, and he had this to say about night time in Zennor. The Cornish night gradually comes down upon the dark, shaggy moors like the fur of some beast upon the pale grey granite masses, ancient and druidical. He was, of course, referencing Cornwall's pre-Christian past, the sacrifices that were made on the local granite-covered hills. Crowley, it was alleged, revived those ancient ceremonies on top of Zennor Carn and at other ancient sites around Cornwall. Anyway, where were we? Oh yes, Ella's just run down through the moorland and she finally arrives, probably exhausted and scratched, at the Eagle's Nest, a large house built over huge exposed lumps of granite. Kay Arnold Forster, a woman of considerable influence in the area at that time, lived in that house, along with her husband, Will, a retired Royal Navy officer of high rank, but he was away on business in North America at the time. Kay had heard Ella screaming her way down the narrow, twisty moorland track down towards her home on the coastal side of the road that leads out from St Ives towards the Land's End. She rushed outside to meet her, and Ella, terribly shaken up, had mumbled something to her about the devil being up at Carn Cottage with her husband Gerald and Crowley. Kay knew that Crowley had been frequently visiting the Vaughans and that he'd performed so-called satanic rituals on the granite-studded Carn just above their rented cottage, and she didn't like Crowley, so she hurried up to Carn Cottage to confront him. Kay, which is short for Catherine, was a justice of the peace and had recently, so the story went, publicly threatened that she would have Crowley kicked out of the district. This version of the story then has Kay either having a row with Crowley outside the hillside property, then dying from a heart attack brought on by the stress or overexertion, or perhaps going inside Carn Cottage to see what they, the Vaughans, Crowley and possibly others too, had seen. Then, having seen it for herself, whatever that it was, it scares her so much that she has a heart attack and dies. Gerald, in this version, by the time Kay and Ella have returned up the hill from the Eagle's Nest, has turned into a gibbering mental wreck, scared witless by whatever it was that they had seen, and he sees out his days in a mental institution on Bodmin Moor, at the other end of Cornwall. I will flesh this whole story out later, maybe in a follow-up episode, and talk about other versions too.
So can you tell me and the listeners a little bit more about the Zennor area, as we're unfamiliar with it? So what is the surrounding landscape like?
Well, Zennor is in the Cornish district of West Penwith. Traditionally, the Cornish called these districts hundreds, so Zennor is in the Penwith hundred. It's a north coast village, but it's set back a little. The cliffs, some of them are over 300 foot high, are just a short walk away through the fields behind the 13th century Tinner's Arms pub and its immediate neighbour, the 6th century St Sonara's church. Even now in 2022, Zennor is little more than just that pub, the church, which is famous for its mermaid legend and ancient ornate carved bench, a few very old stone cottages and various farms which are dotted around the fringes of the main community. Zennor is set amongst many square miles of open, hilly countryside. There are several bleak, granite-topped hills visible around the village. These hills are known as cairns in West Cornwall. Down below those cairns, the rural fields are surrounded by natural stone walls, and they are populated by random cattle and huge lumps of granite, partly in the earth, partly protruding. There are also many old fenced-off tin mine shafts and other mining structures remains, just indiscriminately dotted around the farmers' fields. This area would have had a much larger population back in its mining heyday, but as the industry began to decline, in the 1870s, for example, 2 local mines were shut down, the Cornish tin miners emigrated, utilising their unique expertise elsewhere in the world. Cornish communities grew up in many far-flung countries, including the USA, Australia and South America. I visited 2 such communities in America, one at Grass Valley in California and the other Mineral Point in Wisconsin. The Cornish culture still thrives in those towns, and the architecture echoes the old Cornish homeland. But getting back to the Zena landscape, wherever you look you're going to see granite. Trees are few and far between, and those that you do see are usually windblown from the wild north coast onshore winds. It might look pretty on a summer's day around those parts, but in winter it's a different story. It's bleak, unforgiving and foreboding. Farmers have struggled to make a living around there for thousands of years. The nearest town to Zena is St Ives. It's about 7 miles along the north coast in a northeasterly direction. Many famous artists, writers and other creative types have worked in the far west of Cornwall. Listeners would probably be familiar with some of the names: Julius Olson, Barbara Hepworth, D.H. Lawrence, Patrick Heron, Bernard Leach. D.H. Lawrence and Patrick Heron are both distantly connected to this mysterious death, but in different ways.
So I've heard Crowley was involved in blackmailing activities in Cornwall in the 1930s. Is this true, or is it just a rumour?
It's true. According to researchers like Richard Spence, Crowley was using his eccentric image, his magic ritual work, as a cover for his espionage work, and that ties in with his blackmailing activities. That's not to say that Crowley was a fake, far from it. He was a very talented adherent of the magical arts and devoted to it. You could say that the espionage work he did was the junior partner in the arrangement. That's not to diminish his intelligence work. It's said that Crowley loved his country and would have been happy and proud if any information that he supplied to his handlers helped his nation. We know that Crowley was involved in a small business at Mousehole during the era of Kay's death, the late 1930s, on the south coast of Cornwall. In fact, for anyone listening who doesn't know British geography and doesn't realise just how small Cornwall is, and the far west of Cornwall in particular, it's only about 8 miles from Zena to Mousehole, a fishing village and tourist destination, travelling from the north coast down to the south coast, and in Cornwall generally. You're never very far from the sea on either coast. There are several high hills on the Cornish peninsula where you can do a 360-degree turn and see both the English Channel and the Atlantic within seconds. Anyway, that small business I just mentioned would have just looked like a harmless tourist cafe to most people had they walked by it sucking at their ice creams. It was called the Lobster Pot. Incidentally, in one of the fiction books based on this story, Talk of the Devil by Frank Baker, he calls it the Scallop Shell. See what he did there? That cafe was run by one of Crowley's many girlfriends, a woman called Pat Doherty, although she had several aliases. The business was a front for their shadier dealings, a place where they would have arranged their late-night naughty goings-on around the ancient stone circles and their so-called black masses. I'll just interrupt myself here to say that Crowley once said that he couldn't have performed a black mass because in order to perform it you had to be a Christian priest and believe in the sacrament, and he wasn't and he didn't. The cafe was also where they would have discussed their other business, the luring of unsuspecting influential people into their black magic ceremonies for, well, let's just say for now, to get them to do things that they might later wish that they hadn't. In short, it was about blackmailing useful people in the local community. Policemen, solicitors, doctors, etc., younger people with rich, well-known parents, anyone who might be valuable to them at a later date. And then, when they needed a favour from these compromised people, they'd probably get it. I'll give you an example of how I think this would have worked. I came up with this by piecing together bits of information from different sources, including the fictional versions written about Kay's death, which we can explore later. After Kay died, however that may have been caused, a solicitor and a doctor were said to have been at Carn Cottage very quickly. That was odd in itself, given that the location of her death was very remote and hard to access, especially in the dark, in an area with zero unnatural light. But they supposedly arrived sometime between 12 midnight but before 2 a.m. 2 a.m. was the time of death stated on her death certificate. Bear in mind too that there were no cell phones back then for anyone to have rang them on, and there definitely wasn't a landline phone available at Carn Cottage, although it is possible there may have been one at the Eagle's Nest property. Unlikely, but possible. One of the authors of a fiction version of this event, Frank Baker, definitely picked up on how quickly the doctor and solicitor arrived on site. Frank may well have known more than he was letting on too. It could have been costly saying too much. The doctor, the solicitor and Crowley, if he was there, would have needed a quick agreement on cause and time of death if there was any foul play to be covered up. Crowley had access to so many influential friends and acquaintances, not just during his brief times living in Cornwall, but in general around the world, as he was very well travelled and he made friends everywhere he went. He knew many people in high office, and if he didn't know them personally, you can be sure that he knew someone who did. This would have been, as you can imagine, very useful to his British government handlers. There's an interesting line in one of those semi-fictional works about Kay's death and the culture that surrounded it. I think it was by Dennis Vale Baker. He said something like, "When the collection plates came around after the entertainment, they never went back empty." Frank Baker's fictionalised version of a real story, Talk of the Devil, has Gerald Vaughan, under a fictional name of course, as Crowley's right-hand man, the man who would have been passing that plate around, making sure, with a look at each compromised person, that they got the message, to empty their pockets or else. This all fits in nicely too with comments many people have made, obviously those not aware of his activities, about how Crowley always seemed to have plenty of money but never seemed to do any work.
You mentioned something a few days ago about Crowley, that according to his own diaries, he wasn't even in Cornwall at the time Kay Arnold Foster died at Carn Cottage. Surely that would negate any involvement with her death.
Yes, I did. It's intriguing how this Tregerthen legend has grown up around him being there that night, and yet, as you say, according to his own diaries and various other commentators, I won't say researchers because I don't believe they did too much of that, he wasn't even there. What's that old saying, no smoke without fire? It's worth bearing in mind. According to Crowley's diaries, he was in London that night, around 300 miles away. Most people would assume, naturally, that Crowley couldn't have been responsible for any foul play in far-off Cornwall if he was in London. For most people that might seem obvious, but I have my own ideas about how Crowley could still have caused the lady's death from that distance, if he, for whatever reason, had wanted her dead. She may, for example, have threatened to blow his espionage cover, exposing not just him but others too. Think of a more recent Epstein case, where he ends up dead, conveniently protecting the identities of who knows who. I've come up with a couple of intriguing theories that can be backed up by statements made by people who knew Crowley well and knew what he was capable of. I will discuss those in a later episode. I can also tell you a bit more about the Vaughans, Kay Arnold Forster and her husband, William Arnold Forster. As I said earlier, these characters and others were all used in fictional stories based on this suspicious death by writers such as Frank Baker, Dennis Vale Baker, not related, and A.L. Rouse. They all had some interesting takes on what really happened, but how much of it was fiction and how much of it was truth? It's an ongoing mystery perhaps we'll never truly know.
You alluded to this earlier in a quote. Is it true that D.H. Lawrence, the famous writer, the author of such books as Lady Chatterley's Lover, lived at Centre?
Oh yes, he certainly did. He moved first to Porthcoffin in North Cornwall at the end of December 1915, then later, in the early spring of 2016, this was all during the First World War of course, he and Frida, his German wife, moved to Lower Tregerthen by Zena, to a small cottage property in a little country lane, just a short walk down the hill from Carn Cottage, where Kay's death and the subsequent controversy would occur some 22 years later. Lawrence had married Frida, an upper-class German girl who was related to the infamous von Richthofen, also known as the Red Baron, a German World War I flying ace, back in July 1914. For a while, their next-door neighbours were the Murrays, Catherine and Middleton, both of them well-known writers in their day. And living a little further away, their friend, the music composer Philip Heseltine, who would become very famous in England in the 1940s. Philip, who was fascinated by the occult, had come under the increasing influence of Aleister Crowley. And please remember, this was all around 22 years before the Tregerthen incident ever happened, and he had reinvented himself then as Peter Warlock. Crowley was, and as many will know, an influential member of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and in its ranks were several other well-known people. These included W.B. Yeats, and perhaps the godfather of all weird fiction, the Welshman Arthur Machen. Crowley at that time was almost certainly hanging around and influencing and being influenced by people who were also close to D.H. Lawrence. So it's possible that they might have met. For example, Philip Heseltine, also known as Peter Warlock, was introduced to hashish by Crowley and given guidance into how to find his true will. The idea, as espoused by some writers, that Crowley didn't have any Cornish connection until his brief family holiday in Newlyn, Cornwall in 1938 seems way off the mark to me. I'll say more about that later. This is what I want the Cuckoo Town podcast to major on, the fascinating crossover where the paranormal meets the creative arts world, the writers, the musicians, the artists, etc. Their world has always gone hand in glove with the paranormal, or the supernatural as we used to call it when I was a kid. In fact, creative people are often drawn to the paranormal, or is it the other way around? Getting back to the Lawrences, there were local rumours that David Herbert, DH, and Frida were signalling to German submarines and spying on behalf of the German government. By noting down British and Allied shipping movements, and there was talk of them singing loud patriotic German songs too, but these turned out to be Hebridean folk songs. The Lawrences were harassed by British government people, some of whom even broke into their cottage to search for incriminating evidence. The Lawrences were both eventually expelled from Cornwall by military order by Major General Weston. I'd love to do a few episodes on DHL's time in Cornwall at some point. He was an interesting character, with equally interesting acquaintances, musicians, writers, poets, artists, etc., some of whom, like Peter Warlock, were definitely involved in doing weird rituals around the Zenit area. The local aristocracy were fully immersed into these strange clandestine activities too. For example, D.H. Lawrence wrote a letter to Lady Cynthia Asquith saying, about Lady Mary Starr, another aristocrat, "The stars descend naked into old tin mine shafts, and they sit there for hours."
Can you tell us a little more about the Arnold Fosters?
Catherine K. Arnold Foster, née Cox, was only 51 when she died at Carn Cottage. According to the official report, she died of heart failure. Speaking for myself, I don't dispute it, but it's more about the how and the why. Kay was brought up first in Kensington, London, then a little later in Woking, Surrey, a town I know well. I lived and worked there for many years, and my dad grew up there. I know the big house on Hook Heath where Kay grew up. Hook Heath has always been an affluent area. Her old family home has some nice touches too. It includes beautiful plaques thanking everyone who worked on the house, from the architect to the builder's tea boy. No one was left out. It's an important point, as it shows you the benevolent nature of her family background and possibly hints at her probable politics. Some of the fiction written about the Arnold Fosters has her husband down as a Nazi sympathiser, but in real life I doubt that's true, as Kay, who had been at Cambridge University, was involved in the women's rights movement, and I doubt that she'd have been interested in living with someone of that disposition. Kay was also a part of a Bloomsbury artistic creative set, where she had met and been in a relationship with Rupert Brooke, the well-known poet. Fast forward to 1938, and by now Kay is living at the Eagle's Nest with her husband, Will Arnold Foster, an ex-high-ranking Royal Navy officer who had seen action in World War I. Will was an elf-like, highly intelligent man with many talents. These included garden design and art. He was once invited to dinner at the White House in Washington by President Herbert Hoover and was instrumental in setting up the League of Nations, the UN's forerunner.
When did you first hear about this mystery?
I'm not 100% sure when I first heard about the Tregerthen horror, but I believe it was mentioned to me in a conversation at a luncheon I attended at a country pub on Dartmoor in England. I think it was in about 2015. I'd been invited to the lunch by the late Michael Williams, who was by then an elderly gentleman. Michael was a well-known paranormal researcher stroke writer when I was in my teens. His supernatural books stood proudly alongside works by authors such as Peter Underwood and Brad Steiger on my bookshelves. At the pub, the Highwayman Inn, Michael had placed me at a little low-light alcove table alongside some more mature ladies. One of them had been Colin Wilson's secretary, the writer and researcher. Their conversation that day, mostly about the paranormal and Colin Wilson, was fascinating.
So how and why did this Tregerthen legend gradually grow? Kay's cause of death, the official one given on her death certificate anyway, seems, well, normal.
The Cornish, or at least some of them, are a cynical, suspicious tribe. I mean that in a complimentary way. They have an earthy, natural intelligence. They can sniff out half-truths and lies. I believe the rumours probably began to circulate not that long after Kay's death. There had been a long history of so-called black magic rituals in this far western part of Cornwall, long before Crowley arrived, and the local people certainly always knew about it. As Michael Williams, a proud Cornishman, once said to me,
"Oh, the Cornish have always had a bush telegraph that would put CIA and the MI5 to shame."
many local people probably agreed that Kay died of heart failure, but where they may have differed was on the cause of her fatal heart attack. Some would have thought it was just a natural happening, but others that it was deliberately brought on by a malicious person or persons. There's so much information available, and I can't possibly squeeze it all into this first episode. so we'll try to expand on the details later.
You've mentioned a few times well-known authors using this real-life event in their fiction. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, the rumours soon became fodder for the local writers, talented storytellers like Dennis Vale Baker, A.L. Rouse and Frank Baker, who were always on the lookout for exciting storylines and were happy to use this real event in their fictional books. When you've read all these fictional books based on Kay's death, as I have several times, it's confusing work trying to figure out what is the fiction and what is the fact. Part of that process is working out which fictional characters corresponded to which real-life people. I will say more about each of these fictional books in a later episode, but for now I'll just list two of them, and I think the two most relevant. The first one, by Frank Baker, is called Talk of a Devil. It was published in 1956. The second one is a very short story by A.L. Rouse. His is called A Night on the Carn. It was published in 1984. These writers both knew, in real life, the main characters involved in the events surrounding the death of Kay Arnold Forster. Bear in mind too what I said earlier, that they perhaps couldn't tell us everything that they knew, even in coded fictional form. They could perhaps only best hint at it, but they too might have had an early demise. I owe most of what I know about this case so far to Paul Newman. His book, The Tregerthen Horror, was an absolute pleasure to read. I learnt so much from it. I highly commend it. Paul couldn't get at some of the classified information to fully unravel this mystery, but he encouraged others to pick up the Tregerthen baton where he left off. Sadly, he died. I hope it was of natural causes, back in 2007. This is where my friend Bob Osborne enters my story. I only recently met him, albeit only online so far, but he has been a great help to me already in my research. Bob knows a lot more than I do about this case. He's tracked down people who have inside knowledge, and he has the distinct advantage of living in Zena. Bob will be joining me here at Cuckoo Town soon to enlighten us all with his research into this Crowley and Cornwall saga and all the other events and people that surround the story. He's currently working on a documentary about this case, and I'm sure he'll share information on that too. The Richard Spence book, Secret Agent 666, was also helpful to me as regards the Crowley espionage angle, but not so much regarding the Tregerthen event itself.
You've been listening to Cuckoo Town, a Leviathan Media production. Copyright Mark Anthony Wyatt, 2022. The Cuckoo song, written by Michael Pretorius over 400 years ago, was performed by Mark, with a brief intro from Clarence Ashley. If you've enjoyed the show, please subscribe, like, share, save us to your favorites, and all that good stuff. Oh, and please don't forget to tell your friends about Cuckoo Town. Find us on all major podcast platforms.
We'll see you next time when we'll be taking another stroll down a road less travelled. Oh, just one more thing before you go. Be lucky! Oh, the cuckoo, she's a pretty bird. She warbles as she flies, but she never hollers cuckoo until the 4th day of July. Jack of diamonds, you're the meanest heart I know. Whether you're up my poor pockets, my silver and gold, I'm going up on a mountain, gonna build me a whiskey still, and I'll sell you one bottle for a $20 bill. Going up on a mountain, gonna stand there looking down, so I can see my pretty baby whenever she comes around. Oh, the cuckoo, she's a pretty bird. She warbles as she flies, and she never hollers cuckoo until the 4th day of July. Oh, the cuckoo, she's a pretty bird. She warbles as she flies, but she never hollers cuckoo until the 4th day of July.
Anything we should be working on?
Yeah. You might practice walking without dragging your knuckles on the floor.
Albert, let's talk about knuckles. For the last time, I knocked you down. I felt bad about it. The next time is going to be a real pleasure.
You listen to me. While I will admit to a certain cynicism, the fact is that I'm a naysayer and hatchet man in the fight against violence. I pride myself in taking a punch, and I'll gladly take another because I choose to live my life in the company of Gandhi and King. My concerns are global. I reject absolutely revenge, aggression, and retaliation. The foundation of such a method is love. I love you, Sheriff Truman.
Albert's path is a strange and difficult one.
Dark Notes podcast. If you like music and
high strings,
horror, high strangeness, you should listen.